and welcome to the virtual Common Hour. My name is Rachel Anderson-Rayburn, and I'm the co-chair this year, along with Jim Strick of the Common Hour Committee and an associate professor of theater. I'd like to introduce our most fabulous ASL interpreter, Emily Phipps. Please note that you will need to select split screen if you want to be able to see the ASL interpretation while a PowerPoint or video is up. We are very happy that all of you are here with us today. The Common Hour began in the spring of 2010 with the purpose of bringing the entire Franklin and Marshall community to gather for culturally and academically enriching events and pizza weekly during the academic year. It is the only regularly scheduled event that brings all of the F&M as well as the local community together. We continue our tradition of gathering weekly as a community to share this common experience and continue the conversations. Next week's Common Hour features a panel discussion entitled Fueling the Fire, Racism Highlighted in the Flame of COVID. This event was proposed by Anaya Brown-Moore, class of 22, and the Black Student Union, and will feature Evita Colon, India Folk, Michelle Patterson, and Aenre Aline. This semester, we are featuring student groups as virtual pizza servers. This week's group is Chi Omega, and today's pizza flavor is roasted red peppers and Brussels sprouts. Thank you, Chi Omega. Chi Omega Phi Lambda Chapter is a women's sorority that exemplifies the values of community and scholarship. Through their biggest philanthropy events, Dip Sync and Chi Omegathon, they raise over $6,000 annually for the Make-A-Wish Foundation. They strive to foster a sense of advocacy and volunteerism on both the F&M campus and the Lancaster community. We will have a Q&A at the end of the hour. Students, staff, and faculty can submit questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window. We won't identify people by name, but please tell us in the Q&A if you're a student and what year you are, or for faculty and staff, what department or office you are in. And now I'd like to introduce the proposer of today's event, Amy Rufo, who's the assistant to the CIO and coordinator of IT procurement.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us today. I know there's a lot going on in F&M Zoom land, so I appreciate your time. I'd also like to thank the Common Hour Committee and all of the sponsors of this event, F&M Votes, the North Foundation, and the Government Department with support from the Richard F. Scheer Memorial Fund. Today, we're going to hear from Carol Kuniholm. She's the chair of Fair Districts PA, and she leads this statewide coalition to reform Pennsylvania's redistricting process. Fair Districts has grown from a handful of organizational partners in 2015 to a grassroots network of more than 40 local groups and multiple statewide project teams, all led by volunteers. Carol received her PhD in literature from the University of Pennsylvania and worked for over a decade as a youth pastor. Her work as a board member at the League of Women Voters led her to focus on the plight of gerrymandering and how to end it in Pennsylvania. In the beginning, she was told that not many people would care about gerrymandering, and I would say she's proved them wrong. She was recently named one of 30 influencers in Pennsylvania's politics by the Caucus, a watchdog publication of LNP. I met Carol about 4 years ago, and she has this uncanny ability to inspire people to spend hours and hours on a wonky topic that's difficult to explain to the average voter, let alone our Pennsylvania legislators. Her passion and energy are infectious, and her positive coaching and generous spirit are motivational to thousands of volunteers. In my case, I went from organizing one local presentation to meeting with my state senator for the first time in my life. Now, I'm the statewide communications director for Fair Districts. In a time of political strife, I've anchored myself to this nonpartisan work. It's brought a sense of civic pride I never felt before. If you've never met with your state senator or representative, I encourage you to do so. Pick a topic, and of course, I hope it's to end gerrymandering. Do your research, schedule a meeting, and have a conversation. With that, I'll hand it over to Carol.
Hello. Thank you, Amy, for that introduction. And thank you to the Franklin and Marshall community for inviting me to be part of this series. Thank you to all who continue to make this work during this really strange time. And I'm just really honored to be here with you. I appreciate Amy's introduction. I had never met with a state senator until 5 years ago. I was invited to meet with Senator Lisa Boscola to talk about gerrymandering, and I had never actually heard of gerrymandering. So it's been a steep learning curve ever since, and many people have joined me on that steep learning curve, and I invite you to join me on that as well today. We are going to talk about voting. We're going to talk about districts. We're going to talk about issues that matter. I just want to say a few words about Fair Districts PA as we get started. We are a fiscal project of the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania. We are completely nonpartisan. And as Amy said, we are completely volunteer staffed and volunteer led. And we have a bi-weekly approximate number of 5,000 volunteers across the state who consider themselves active Fair Districts PA volunteers working on nonpartisan reform work. We're also part of the People Powered Fair Maps Initiative, which is the League of Women Voters national initiative to address redistricting across the country. So we have an election coming toward us, and one of the things the League of Women Voters likes to say is that every vote counts, and yet we know that there are many people who feel like their vote doesn't count and don't vote because of it. We'd like to say that your vote is your voice, and there are people who feel like their vote is not their voice and their voice is not being heard. So as we start, I'd like to invite you just to think for a moment about what issues matter to you. Do you feel like you're being heard on those issues? And if not, why not? And I want you to keep those issues in mind as we go through this, because I think as Amy said, there are many, many, many of us who are working together, and we all come to this with different issues in mind. I'm going to share a little bit about some of the issues that have brought me to this topic and that continue to motivate me, but I invite you to think about your own issues as we go through this. I want to start with a little bit of bad news, which is that the national trust in our government is at an all-time low. I came of age during the late 60s, early 70s. There was a lot of civil unrest. There were a civil rights movement. There were protests against the war in Vietnam. I turned 18 right about the time of the Watergate hearings and watched them during my freshman year of college with my college roommate. There was an oil embargo and rationing of oil. And yet the trust in government now is far worse than it was in the late 60s and early 70s. Right now, about 2% of Americans say they trust the government just about all the time. I have yet to meet those people. And about 18% say they trust the government most of the time. And the rest of us, about 80%, feel like we're not sure we trust the government much at all. In Pennsylvania, is that the case? Your wonderful Franklin and Marshall Center for Opinion Research has done great work kind of tracking how Pennsylvanians feel about the state. Are we headed in the right direction or the wrong direction? And for quite a long time, most Pennsylvanians have said, well, we're really not heading in the right direction. In October 2019, there was a brief moment of hope when people thought, yes, we are. We're going in a good direction. More than half of us for the first time in a long time, and it's been going downhill ever since. But I want us to stop and think, when we think about the government, when we think about who should be listening to us, who do we think of? For a lot of us, we're thinking about the president. We had the presidential debate last night. That's on lots of people's minds. We think of the president, or we think of the governor. We think of the executive branch most often as those who should be listening. We don't think about the judiciary a lot, although right now we are, because of the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the potential confirmation of a new justice. But really the legislative branch is the branch that is supposed to be closest to us as people, most representative of our interests, of our voices. The policies of the legislature are the ones that are supposed to represent us. The budget is supposed to represent our priorities. And that, I think, is something that we don't think about enough, but what I'd like to focus on with you today as we talk. The legislative branch, and is it responsive to us? And if not, why not? So to get there, we're going to do some vocabulary. Well, before we do that, I want to pause one more piece of bad news, and this is really bad news. In 2014, 2 academics studied congressional action on a lot of policy issues, and here's what they found. They found that when the preferences of economic elites and the stands of organized interest groups are controlled for, The preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. That's a lot of different ways to say, if you think your voice is not being heard, you're right. Your voice is not being heard. You have almost zero impact on public policy. And they were studying Congress. I would say the same from what I've seen is true in Harrisburg. The average person has almost no impact on public policy, despite what our founders intended, despite the way that it's supposed to work. Right now, we have very little say in public policy, in public budgets, in what happens in Congress or what happens in Harrisburg. So to understand that more, we're going to talk about some definitions. We're going to do a little history. We're going to do a little math, a little mapping, tell a few stories, and we're going to end up by talking about what you could do, how you could engage, what would be actions that the average citizen can get involved in that might make a significant difference. So a little bit of vocabulary, definitions. First one, reapportionment. So every 10 years after the US Census, the congressional seats are redivided among the states. There are always 435 seats in the House of Representatives. That doesn't change. So depending on population shifts, some states gain, some lose. You don't have to lose population, but if you lose population relative to the rest of the country, then you would end up losing a seat. Pennsylvania has been losing seats for the last several decades. We lost 2 seats in 2001. We lost 1 seat in 2011. The predictions are that we will lose another seat in 2021. So the census is going on right now. We're not quite sure when it's ending. Sometime in the next month, it will be over. And then all that data will be gathered, given to Congress. Congress will divide out the seats again. And the next reapportionment will take place in early 2021 after that census data is given to Congress. When that happens, pretty much guaranteed, Pennsylvania will be losing a seat. Some states say really the same. They don't have a lot of change. Some states are continually growing. Some states are pretty much losing population relative to others. And Pennsylvania is one that is losing population. So after that comes vocabulary word 2, which is redistricting. So after the reapportionment takes place, after the census data is given to the states, then the districts all have to be redrawn. And that's congressional districts, but also state legislative districts, that's state House and state Senate districts. They're all redrawn because they all have to have about the same population. Congressional districts, the government tells us how many we have. The states decide what the boundaries are. And in Pennsylvania, that happens through a normal legislative process. The map is introduced by the majority party as a bill. It's then voted on by both houses, and it's signed into law by the governor. There's not really any rules for this other than that it has to be done in accordance with the Federal Voting Rights Act, which says that you can't draw lines to deny minority voters an opportunity to participate in the process and to elect their representatives. Now the state, I've gotten stuck. Give me just a moment to figure out why. There we go. State House and Senate districts, the rules are set by the Pennsylvania Constitution. And there was a constitutional convention in 1968 that put these rules in place. So when people say, oh, it's been done the same way in Pennsylvania for centuries, it's not actually true. It's been done the same way since the 1968 Constitutional Convention. That convention said that there were already 50 senatorial, 203 representative districts, which will be composed of compact and contiguous territory. That means they can't have bits and pieces all over the place. They've got to be fairly compact, as nearly equal in population as possible. And unless absolutely necessary, no county, town, borough, township, or ward shall be divided in forming those districts. It's done by a legislative reapportionment commission, not all of our legislators, just 4 legislative leaders, the majority and minority leaders from the House and the Senate, or people they choose, but usually they want to do this themselves. And then those 4 choose a 5th member if they can agree, which they never do. And so if they can't agree, then the Constitution says that 5th person is chosen by a majority of the entire membership of the Supreme Court. So sometimes the court is controlled by Republicans, which was the case in 2001 and 2011, which means 3 out of those 5 votes were Republicans, and the Republicans had the deciding vote. If the court is Democratic, which is currently the case, that 5th person will be a Democrat, and 3 of the 5 Democrats will have the deciding vote. and they will be the ones who determine what our district lines will be, which brings us to our third word, the big one, which is gerrymandering. Now, gerrymandering it just means the manipulation of electoral maps for political advantage, messing around with maps to advantage a party or to advantage a person. And one of the earliest to do this was Governor Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts in 1812. And he signed off on a map that looked like a salamander. It was not compact. It did not make sense. And the press called him out on that. They took his name and they took the word salamander, put them together. And that's the term gerrymander. It dates back to Elbridge Gerry in 1812. The same people who draw the maps have a vested interest in making districts to keep themselves in office or to give their party a benefit. And that is a conflict of interest, and it undermines the integrity of our elections. And no other major democracy right now allows an elected official a role in drawing their own district lines, except here in the US. There were other countries that did have that. Canada had a problem with this, and they changed it years ago so that that no longer is the case. But here in the US, we still allow legislators to draw their own lines. Think of it a little bit like letting a player on a team also be the referee of the team or the umpire of the team, calling the shots, calling the game, calling the outs when they're still a team member themselves. It's a conflict of interest. So here you might have seen a graphic like this. We created our own. We didn't want it to be red and blue because we often think about this too much in terms of red and blue, but think of it as any two parties. If you had a district that had 30 orange voters and 20 green voters, you could draw it in a particular way that the orange gets 3 districts, the green gets 2 districts. It's perfect representation. It's not ideal because what it does, it creates safe districts for all 5 of them. So whoever was the legislator in any of those districts doesn't really have any competition in the general election. So it's not ideal, but it certainly is fair in terms of representation. Now imagine that the green are the orange are the ones who get to draw the districts, and they decide that they're gonna do their own thing on this, and they draw them in a very compact way, but to give themselves the advantage in every single district. It'd be compact, not really fair, and there might be slightly more competitive than the other ones, but it's not ideal either. And the next one is kind of the classic gerrymander, which is the orange actually doesn't have the right to draw it. Somehow green gets the right to draw it, and green draws it so that they give themselves an advantage, even though they don't have one. So they're not compact, they're not fair, they're not particularly representative. That's a different way of forming gerrymandering. But none of these, I don't like any of those, because to me, gerrymandering is not so much about parties, it's about people. And the truth is, none of us are all the same. And we have Republicans who will always be Republicans. They will always vote Republican. It doesn't matter who the candidate is. And there are some who say, it does matter to me who the candidate is, and I'm going to think a bit before I vote. There are Democrats who are deep blue, and they will always be blue. And some say, well, I usually vote Democratic, but I could be convinced to vote for the other party. There are independents. There are Green Party. Pennsylvania has a Libertarian Party. We have a Prohibition Party. And if you had a population like this and you drew lines like that, what you'd end up with is competitive districts where your legislators would have to appeal to everybody. They'd have to somehow convince a majority of very different people that they had solutions in mind and that they were going to follow through. And if they convinced those people once and then did not follow through, then the likelihood of them being reelected would be small. They would be held accountable. They could be voted out of office. So think about if you had a population like that, and if you drew districts like that, you would have a competitive and responsive situation where your legislators would have to listen and where you could hold them accountable. But you could gerrymander that. You could draw those districts a little differently. It wouldn't look gerrymandered, but you could draw it so that you had a very safe red district and a very safe blue district. And the people in those districts would really not have to listen to voters at all. That's one form of gerrymandering. And the buddymander is a term. Walter Olson, who is from Maryland, he's been involved in the gerrymandering issue in that state where the Democrats have very actively gerrymandered. He came up with the term the buddymander, which is incumbent protection from both sides. So you can draw the maps with legislators on both sides happily working together to draw very safe districts for themselves in which the voter has no voice. Now, I'm not a great gerrymanderer or buddymanderer, and you need a larger population to do it really well. So I end up with one competitive district and one very red district and one blue district. If you were good at this, you could do it in a way that you end up with no competitive districts at all. I have to say, the first time I met with my own state senator to talk about this issue, he said, well, you know, it's really not a problem because my colleague, his colleague was the opposite party. My colleague and I, we sit down and we divide up the map and we get along great and it's all good. And I was stunned. I said, well, that's really very nice for you and your colleague. But as a voter, I find that a little troubling. And the more I think about it, the more troubling it is, because not only did he not think that was wrong, he didn't even understand why, as a voter, I might think it was wrong, that he and his colleague were cheerfully dividing up the map so that they both were choosing their own voters and really were not being held to account at all. Now, gerrymandering's been around a long time. As I said, 1812, Elbridge Gerry. So it's been going on for at least 200 years, actually a bit longer, but it's changed in recent years. And you can look at what was Congressional District 7 and see that over time it became more strange. 2002 looks a little odd. And then 2011, 12, 13, that period, that redistricting suddenly went very strange. And that district, you look at that and you think, how is that possible? And what's going on there? Well, what changed? Mapping technology. Think about what you can do with your phone now that you would never have dreamed of doing 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And think about the kind of data mining capabilities that are available, the information that's available about people that is just out there, what you might watch, what you might buy, what articles you look at online, all of that information. And what happened in 2011 was this program called Maptitude. There are several others, which began to be able to map out very, very, very precisely the margin of victory for each precinct, for each block, for each neighborhood in any election. What would the turnout be? Who's registered to vote? What kinds of issues will make them vote one way or another? It got very, very precise, and it made it possible in a very, very new way for legislators, for the people drawing the maps, to choose the voters in a way. In the past, gerrymandering was kind of primitive. You'd have a paper map, you'd stick some thumbtacks where you had candidates that you wanted, you'd draw the map with pencil around them. Being on computer with mapping technology and the kind of data possibilities and the algorithms to predict what's happening, you can do it with very precise lines to control the outcomes. Let me tell you a few other forms of gerrymandering as we go along. One is called cracking, and that's when you take a population and you splinter it among districts so that that population becomes an irrelevant minority. And so when you look at what was Congressional District 7, you can see that an area outside of Philadelphia that normally would be a very swing area where there's red and blue living side by side. So a candidate would have to appeal to all of those. Instead, it was drawn very, very carefully to create safe Republican districts for specific candidates. Now, Congressional District 7 was notorious on any list of the worst gerrymandered districts in the country. Congressional District 7 would be there. And you can tell it's bad when they start giving a district nicknames. And the nickname for District 7 was Goofy Kicking Donald Duck, which if you look, you can kind of see it. So that's cracking, and it shows how extreme it was becoming. Another form is packing, and that's concentrating voters of one party or group in as few districts as possible and really cramming them in there so they have far more than they would need to win that, but put as many as possible into one district to reduce their influence in the remaining districts. So Congressional District 1 pulled as many Democrats from the part of Philly, but also the region north and south of Philly, to pull Democrats into that, to leave the areas around it Republican, so that there would be more Republican districts than Democratic. And what happened in that mapping season, the 2011 congressional district, that map created a 13-5 advantage to Republicans, even though in most elections it comes down to almost 50-50. So it was 13-5, kind of locked in by doing this really careful cracking and packing. Last summer, we did a survey with your wonderful Franklin and Marshall public interest, your census, I've just blocked myself, your Center for Opinion Research did a really terrific poll for us to see what do Pennsylvanians think about the current system of drawing legislative districts in Pennsylvania. Now remember, the legislative leaders and a person chosen by the Supreme Court are drawing them, and they are gerrymandered. And so what are the impacts on the public? Well, the public said it allows party leaders to put party interests ahead of voters' interests, creates polarization and gridlock, lets officials choose their voters instead of voters choosing their officials, gives voters less choice on election day, and prevents us from holding our representatives accountable. Far less thought it's working fine because legislators know their districts. In fact, the 5 people who drew our current House and Senate districts were from only 2 counties, Allegheny County. There were 3 from there and 2 from Delaware County. That was it. And if you look at some of the districts, you can see they did not know the districts, and they were not really that interested in doing a good job to make sure people were represented. Works fine as it is and should be left alone. Very few people actually think that. I could spend an hour just giving you evidence of each of these things, giving you evidence of the ways that this creates polarization and gridlock, the ways it allows elected officials to choose voters, the ways it prevents voters from holding representatives accountable. I could go on quite a long time about all of that. I want to say just a few words, though, back to continue on about our congressional districts as they were. There's District 7. It wasn't just the people in District 7 who lost the opportunity to be represented. District 6 was the same thing happened. Look at District 16. That was drawn to pull in some very democratic areas to not have a voice, and oddly pulled in Reading, one of the poorest communities in the country, at the time, one of the poorest communities in the country, drew Reading into the same district with where you are in Lancaster, lots of farming, Lancaster City, and then drew that in with the southern part of Chester County, which, if you know Chester County, that area is extremely wealthy. There are some really lovely horse farms where people still ride to hounds and chase foxes. And then Coatesville, one of the poorest communities in Chester County, were all drawn together into District 16. So there's a lot going on there that puts people in a way that they all lose their voice. They all lose the possibility of being represented. They all lose the ability to hold their legislators accountable. So when we started working on this back in 2016, Fair Districts PA began at the very beginning of 2016. We really didn't know how do you measure this? Some states would say, oh, we have the worst gerrymandering. Well, we had one of the worst districts, Congressional District 7, Goofy Kicking Donald. But what did that mean? And then during the year of 2016, beginning into 2017, there started to be a lot of attention to mathematical ways to measure this. One of the ways was called the efficiency gap. It got a lot of attention in 2016 because there was a court case in Wisconsin that looked at the efficiency gap and said you can begin to measure how many votes are wasted by how districts are drawn. When I read the report of that, I said, wait a second, they're saying that you can show mathematically which states have been most harmed. Wisconsin, where this court case was happening, wasn't even on the list of the worst 10 states. And the worst, according to their measurements, was Pennsylvania. Another way to measure is seats to votes, how many votes are cast. And if you have about 50% of the votes, you would assume you'd get about 50% of the seats. And in terms of the skew between votes cast and seats won, Pennsylvania was the worst. There's other ways to measure it. And in all of those, Pennsylvania was among the 5 worst. The only other state that was among the 5 worst was Michigan. And that was not only above Pennsylvania in one of those measures. Pennsylvania, mathematically, from everything that I can tell, was by far the most gerrymandered in the country, which led to a lawsuit in 2017, 2018. The League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania versus the Pennsylvania General Assembly was filed in Commonwealth Court, and eventually moved to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court found that the map drawn was in fact contrary to law, is the way that they phrased it. And the case appealed to the Pennsylvania Constitution, Article 1, Section 5, which says elections shall be free and equal. Interestingly, there were 2 other court cases filed during the same period of time in federal court, And those ended up, they would have gone to the Supreme Court. They would have been dismissed where other gerrymandering cases have been dismissed. But the state Supreme Court said our Constitution has this requirement that our elections be free and equal. Gerrymandered maps deprive us of free and equal elections. And the court required a new map and eventually supplied that new map in February of 2018. There's the original map, the plan that was found contrary to law. And you can see the craziness that was going on down here in the Southeast, but also Lehigh Valley historically had been one district. Instead, it was divided into two. Erie had always been one district. It was divided into two. This going on around Pittsburgh, very strange stuff happening there, and districts just drawn in ways that were very difficult to even understand how you would get to your congressperson's office, how they would ever represent you in the districts drawn as they were. In that, with that plan, as I said, there was a baked in, entrenched, unbreakable advantage to Republicans, 13-5 in every election, no matter how many votes were cast. That would be the outcome. With the new map, Erie was restored to one district. Montgomery County now is back into being a district. Lancaster County is only in one district instead of divided. The Lehigh Valley is back into one. It's much more reasonable looking, and the outcome is much closer to votes cast, seats won. So in the most recent election, the Republicans had a bit more than half of the vote, and they won exactly half of the seats. So what you see is that maps matter. And there are people who say, oh, the maps don't matter. It really doesn't matter. It's just where people live. But you can tell, number one, by how much attention people put into drawing these maps that they matter. But you could also see in the way that the court drawn map changed the outcome that maps absolutely do definitely matter. But lawsuits are divisive, confusing, and expensive. And they are also at best a partial and temporary remedy. The map drawn for congressional districts in 2018 was used in the 2018 election. It will be used again in the 2020 election, and then it's back to a new map will have to be drawn next year to be used in 2022. There's now legal precedent that will prevent the most extreme gerrymandering, but there's no good rules in place about how it ought to be done. And it didn't change our state house and Senate districts. And those are among some of the worst in the country. Now that's really hard to measure because there's so many states, there's so many districts, but the Princeton Gerrymandering Project has been working hard to run tests on state districts. Some states only have one district, so that's not a problem. Some states only have two districts, hard to gerrymander, but they've discovered that among the states that do have enough districts that you can begin to play games with how they're drawn, Pennsylvania is one of just a handful that consistently fails tests to see if they are drawn in a fair way. In the 2018 election, that seat to vote skew, Pennsylvania's seat to vote skew was the worst in the country. We had a 9% gap between votes cast and seats won. The two states that came closest were Michigan and North Carolina, with 6% between votes cast and seats won. Now, some people say that's about demographics, that people live in cities, that you have to account for that. And yet Pennsylvania does have some cities, but there are states with far larger cities. There are states with equally unbalanced populations between urban and rural that do not have anything like this kind of a skew between votes cast and seats won. So you can see we are sadly gerrymandered in our state house and Senate districts, and those were not addressed by the Supreme Court case at all. I want to mention something. People assume that well, okay, this is a problem for voters, but legislators don't mind. They all love it. The truth is, legislators themselves are not the ones drawing those maps. Some of them think that they are, the ones newly elected. They say, well, we have the right to draw those maps. They're not the ones drawing the maps. There's 4 legislative leaders, a 5th person chosen by the court. And what legislators who are honest about this will say, it's really hard to represent a population that doesn't make sense, that sprawls around, that crosses weird rivers, that is on one side of a ridge and down the other, that district that was Reading and Lancaster and Chester County. How do you represent that? You end up having to have more offices. You end up having to have more staff so you can have satellite offices in strange places. But more than that, the power is held by the people who draw the map. The power is held by the party leadership, and legislators find themselves pawns in a partisan chess game, and the leaders are the ones who have the control. And the current system, many legislators will say, puts too much power in the hands of just a few leaders. And that ends up controlling what happens in our legislature and what kind of bills get heard. There's stories about these districts, and everybody who gets started on this ends up kind of looking at maps and saying, oh my, what happened there? Oh, what are they doing? People can get really obsessed with this and spend a lot of time digging around in maps. And it's interesting to do. There are lots of stories. So one of the stories was told by a league member who's been working on this for 30 years. She tells a story of Ross Township in Allegheny County. There was a legislator there in the 90s who was intent on representing his constituents well. He voted the way his constituents, what would benefit his constituents. He thought carefully about that. He asked his constituents their opinions. He really worked hard to vote his conscience and vote his constituents, and his leadership did not like that. They told him to stop. And they told him if he didn't stop, they would X him off the map. I've heard many stories of people being told there will be consequences. And one of the consequences, if you don't vote the way the leaders tell you to, is you will be X'd off the map. So look carefully at that District 29, the light yellow district right there in the middle. That was in 1991 when the map was redrawn in 2001. District 29 is gone. It was actually moved to Bucks County. The other side of the state vanished, and that legislator's career was effectively over. So he was punished, obviously, but his constituents were also punished because they were people who had a legislator who listened to them and tried to do what they wanted. And suddenly they went from having reasonable representation to being divided out into 4 different districts. And look at the way those districts are drawn. Look at the strange shapes of these, making it far more difficult for those legislators to represent constituents. And many don't even try. They just say, okay, I got my district. I hope it's a safe one. I'll just keep my head down. I'll do what the leaders tell me. And that's what happens. Lancaster is an interesting one that once people start looking at maps, Lancaster kind of surfaces fast as there are quite a few pieces that are not contiguous, which according to the Constitution, they are supposed to be contiguous. So you can see there's these little bits and pieces scattered around. And the truth is Lancaster City itself is not contiguous, and Lancaster Township is not contiguous. So people will say, oh, we're just trying to keep the city intact. That's all that's happening here. But then when you look, you say, wait a second. So Lancaster City is being kept intact, and Lancaster Township is divided out into 4 different House districts. What's happening there? Well, you can take a look. There's a great website called Azovia we've given it a URL, tinyurl.com, Turzide data, and you can see the data that was used by the leadership in drawing those districts. And you can begin to piece together the story. Who's being cracked out? Who's being packed in? What's happening to your representation? If somebody needs a good topic for a paper, there's lots of interesting things lurking in the numbers and in the maps and in the data out there. That would be a place to take a look. But the key question is not which party gets the most seats, but whose vote counts most, whose voices are discounted, what values are rewarded, what values are ignored. And it's not about parties so much as people, priorities, and policy. So for me, I'm a registered independent. It doesn't really matter to me which party is winning. What matters to me a lot is what policy they're enacting, and does it work for the people of Pennsylvania? So I'm going to tell 2 stories. One is the story that drew me into this topic, that got me involved in the League of Women Voters in the first place. Amy mentioned that I was a youth pastor. I was a youth pastor in a church in Chester County in a fairly affluent community. And we worked in partnership with a church in Kensington, which is one of the poorest communities in the state. It's one of the poorest communities in Philadelphia. And what I discovered was that kids in my youth group went to schools where they had counselors and libraries and music programs and theater and great field trips and everything that they could need. And the kids in Kensington, whose backgrounds were very difficult, who had seen lots of trauma, who had not many opportunities, they were in very crowded classrooms. Many of their schools had maybe 1 part-time counselor. And I was really puzzled and discovered that Pennsylvania has the most inequitable funding, school funding in the country by far. And in fact, our contribution, take the federal out of it, but our state and local contribution is twice as uneven as the next most uneven states, more than twice as inequitable as the US average for inequality. And this gets very personal when you start looking at how much per pupil spending is in specific schools. So the top two there are within half an hour of where I live, Bryn Athyn and Lower Merion. They're very affluent communities. They are very well-funded schools. They have anything that you could think of, probably among the most well-resourced schools in the world, honestly. They're very well-funded schools. And then I live not far from the schools in Philadelphia or your school system in Lancaster. There's a lawsuit right now asking the state to fund your school system more equitably. But look, the top funded schools are more than 3 times the spending per student than the least funded schools. That plays out in many, many ways. And this is the one that really got me, was libraries. The kids in my youth group, we realized that the kids that we knew in Kensington didn't have any books. They had no books in their households. They just didn't have books. So we started bringing books down with us, and the kids were excited to have books. And our kids from our church said, hey, let's donate some books to their school library. Turned out they didn't have a school library, weren't going to have a school library, and turned out that most schools in Philadelphia don't have school libraries. In fact, Philadelphia's schools have the worst librarian to student ratio in the country. And in Pennsylvania in general, if you have an affluent school, you are far more likely to have a librarian than if you have a poor school. The full-time librarian, the poorest schools in the state, only 1 out of 5 of them have a full-time library. But even our more well-funded schools don't all have librarians. And in many states, every school has a library. So there's something really wrong here. We have an inequitable school funding model. It doesn't serve our children well. And there are legislators. One of my first legislative friends in this work on redistricting was somebody I met because he was working on school funding. And in his frustration that he couldn't get anything done on school funding, he had begun to look into redistricting and realize, unless we have an accountable legislature, we can't fix things. We can't fix the school funding issue until we fix the redistricting issue. And so he had become a reformer. And one of the first bills that Fair Districts PA supported was his bill. Republican David Carter from Monroe County was trying hard to address school funding and ended up also trying to address redistricting reform. Here's another issue, though, that I came across as I've been studying this that just baffles me. And this is lead. During the period when there was a lot of attention on lead exposure in Flint, Michigan, there were some headlines that said, actually, Pennsylvania has far more trouble with lead than Flint, Michigan. We have 18 cities with far higher lead exposure than Flint, Michigan does. And in Pennsylvania, that lead is not all in the water. Much of it is in the air. We've got old buildings with lead paint, and that lead paint turns into lead dust, and that lead dust is in the air, and children breathe it in. So the headlines were that 10% of kids tested in these cities have lead levels above the level that causes physical harm to those kids. Look how this gray line here is Flint, Michigan. So national headlines that lead at that level was children were being exposed to lead at that level. Look at the lead exposure among tested children in Pennsylvania. It's far, far, far higher. So interestingly, this is not just in one part of the state, this is across the state. Those green areas are places where 6 to 10% of children have tested with elevated blood lead levels. It's all across the state. And those big red dots, those are where there are lots of children who have been exposed to lead, have elevated blood lead levels. It's all the way across the state. It's not just in one place. Across the past 2 decades, there have been 25 bills addressing this introduced in the Pennsylvania legislature. None have been given a vote. In 2017, the Senate approved a resolution to form a committee to study it. And their recommendations are all things that have been introduced into bills across the last 2 decades. We are one of the worst states in terms of children with lead poisoning, one of the top 6. But we can't really compare Pennsylvania with other states because Pennsylvania doesn't require testing. Other states with aging buildings have universal testing laws, and only about 30% of Pennsylvania children have been tested. And lead poisoning can cause permanent brain damage, but it can also slow growth. It can cause learning problems, hearing problems. It can cause criminal activity in people who are just unable to understand the things that they need to understand. It has lots of implications. And what's really troubling to me is every dollar spent on testing and remediation yields a societal savings of over $200. You would think that just addressing this would save money, would save lives, would save a lot of heartbreak. And yet legislators introduce legislation, it goes nowhere. It just sits there. So we try really hard to help people understand and connect the dots between partisan redistricting and then lots of other things that kind of flow from that. The feeling of punished politicians are not being held accountable, the feeling that things are become very divided, the feeling of frustration and anger, unaccountable government, unfair rules. Lots of things kind of flow together. There's lots of dots to connect, and we work really hard to help people understand those. And what we've discovered is that the same people who draw the lines are the people who protect their own seniority, and then they protect unfair processes that block reform, and then they continue to draw the lines. And I call it a tight knot of dysfunction. And it's been really hard trying to figure out how do you pry open that tight knot of dysfunction so that people feel heard, so that good policy is enacted, so that the rules are fair, so that our districts represent us. There are states across the country that have put reforms in place. A lot of them are independent citizens commissions. So citizens are the ones drawing the lines, and the legislators are not drawing the lines. The states that have enacted those are all states that have initiative, citizen initiative. That's how they've got it. They've had it enacted. There's a couple other reforms that have been put in place that have stronger rules, stronger requirements for transparency, some tests. All the states that have put those reforms in place to date are states that have citizen initiatives. That's not something that we have in Pennsylvania. So we've been working hard to end this. We had a very large rally in Harrisburg in March of 2018, one of the largest rallies in recent time. It was great fun, but it did not accomplish what we hoped, which was to get the legislature to pass the bills that we were supporting to create an independent commission. That was last session. We had the most co-sponsors of any bills introduced in last session, and yet our bills were not able to pass. We tried again in this session with 2 bills because it's getting close to the timeline. We had a constitutional amendment and an election code bill. Amy made this wonderful graphic for us trying to explain a really complicated process. And in the final, we ran out of time and we're not able to get that passed. So now we're working on another bill. We call it LACRA, the Legislative and Congressional Redistricting Act. We are trying hard to get some ground rules in place for transparency, engagement, because nothing changes until this changes. And we want fair districts, not red, not blue, just fair. The timeline is super short on this because redistricting will happen next year. By the end of next year, new districts need to have been drawn. Reapportionment is happening in this winter. Redistricting will happen next year. So I invite you to think about how you can get involved. Democracy is not a spectator sport. I'm sure you're all planning to vote, but then it's also important to say, what can we do as citizens to work for change, to make sure that our votes count, to make sure our voices are heard, to make sure that the process is fair. We have lots of ways that you can get involved. You can sign our petition, call legislators, write letters, invite speakers. We've got a great speakers bureau. Follow and share on Fair Districts PA. Draw a map. There's a couple mapping tools out there that you could use, and you can also be part of a mapping competition. There's lots of different things you can do. Go to our website, fairdistrictspa.com, and look at our Take Action section. There's just plenty of information out there that you could use to get further involved. I'll leave this slide here for just a minute so you can see if there's anything here that you want, but that's, thank you for having me. I know that's a lot of information. It's a complicated topic, and we find that once people get started, they just go further and further, want to know more and more. Everything connects to everything else. And unless we have systemic change, it will be very hard to see the policies that you want put into place. So keep those policies in mind, but also think about how do we have structural change to make sure that our voices are heard. So I'll pause, and Rachel, I'm happy to take any questions that you have, and I'll end screen share in just a minute so that we can be seen.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Dr. Kuniholm. We have some interesting questions that have begun to come in, so we'll get through as many as we can. We'll start with the first one from a student. And this student says, Dr. Kuniholm, you mentioned that Canada had problems with gerrymandering with legislators, but has since created a new solution. What method does Canada use now to redistrict?
They have a commission. There are many countries have put commissions in place. It's interesting that there are countries that put commissions of retired administrators or retired professors, or there's lots of different formulas for how to do this. In the US, people have a hard time trusting that there's anybody who would be disinterested enough and non-partial enough. So there's these very elaborate citizen commission plans. But in other countries, it's pretty simple. It's just a few retired administrators. They just draw the lines. That's how Canada does it.
Okay. This is from a faculty member in government. Since we have legislative districts with only one representative each, the outcome of elections will always be disproportionate to the vote to some degree. So wouldn't a better solution be to move from legislative districts with just one representative to multi-member districts elected by proportional representation?
There are a lot of interesting solutions out there, and that's certainly one of them. How we get there is always the question. How do we convince a system that is very much entrenched that it could change? So this is one that there are legislators who say they don't want to give up the idea of having their own single legislator district, but they're open to the idea of better rules or better process. So this is a possible achievable solution. We're not saying this is the only solution or even the best solution. We're saying this is a solution that would work in Pennsylvania that we'd like to see happen. But multi-member districts, there's plenty to be argued for them. It could be a solution. I don't see that happening in Pennsylvania anytime soon. Although there are plenty of people who could say, Carol, we don't see what you're trying to do happening anytime soon either. But I would say that there at least is some legislative support for what we're trying to do.
Okay. This is a little bit more broad. Feel free to take more time with this question if you like. This is from an F&M staff member. In addition to redistricting reform, what other fundamental issues at the state and federal level would you like to see voters pay more attention to?
Wow, there's a lot of issues. I would say the kind of the most structural issues, I see redistricting reform, campaign finance reform, and open primaries as kind of a trifecta. If those three would change, then we would see a real difference in terms of accountability and accessibility, so that it would be a more open system that the average citizen could engage much more easily. So right now, because of campaign finance, it makes it very hard for the average person to run for office. They're up against a pretty strong money machine that's kind of hidden. You don't really know where that money is coming from. And the closed primaries shuts out a lot of involvement. Nationally, about 42% of people are registered as unaffiliated right now. In Pennsylvania, that number is 14%. So it's held artificially low by our closed primary system. So those three, I think, are really important. I think if those three were to change, we would see a lot of change in other things. I know that some people say term limits would be a fix. I don't see that. I think it's good to have legislators who understand the system, and there are some really good legislators who've been there a long time working hard on our behalf. I think it would be much better just to be able to vote out people who don't work on our behalf. I think those three are the ones that I would if we got those three, I think we would see a lot of things change quickly.
I have a question from a faculty member in math. Mathematics and statistics have often been used to quantify the unfairness of certain redistricting, allowing arguments against gerrymandering to be made more objective. During the 2017 Supreme Court case, John Roberts called these data-driven methods, quote, sociological gobbledygook, unquote. Is there any hope of educating the general population or even our state legislators of the value of looking at redistricting objectively if such prominent national figures prefer to take a more subjective approach?
Well, I think it was a hopeful sign that our state Supreme Court did not see them as gobbledygook, that they heard from a number of experts who shared a lot of different statistics and analysis. And I think our state Supreme Court said, no, there's good evidence here, and we're going to hear it. One of our advocacy advisors, we have a team of experienced advocates who like to put complicated things in language that people can understand. He's talked about actuarial tables and said, look, the legislature rules all the time on insurance policy. They don't understand actuarial tables, which are the bedrock of how insurance works. It would be easy to call that gobbledygook, and yet you need that analysis to do insurance properly. And in the same way, we need the mathematical analysis to demonstrate what works and what doesn't work in redistricting. We need legislators to understand the fact that you don't understand all the details doesn't mean that it's not important and useful.
We have, again, sort of a broad question from a faculty member. And this, again, feel free to take this in whatever direction you think is most useful. We'll probably end on this question. How do we change this culture of gerrymandering if those in power have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo that got them into power? You mentioned voter initiative that we don't have, but how do we go about building that?
Yeah, when I started this, I talked to a lot of election reform people. I talked to people in Pennsylvania and people around the country, and pretty much everybody said, I talked to people who would say, this would be the most important change you could make in Pennsylvania, but it will never happen. And I'd say, never happened? League of Women Voters, how long did it take for women to get the vote? It took quite a while, and there were women who were told they would never get the vote, and yet they said, well, it should happen, so we're going to figure out a way to make it happen. But what I was told was it will never happen because you don't have initiative and referendum. The leaders will never give it power, and people of Pennsylvania will never pay attention. And the reality is we've had a lot of people in Pennsylvania pay attention. As Amy mentioned, we've had over 920 public meetings now, attended by over 32,000 people, all of whom then say, okay, put me on your email list. We now have an email list of about 60,000 people who will send emails to legislators when asked saying, fix this thing. Now that hasn't been enough yet, but we were making great progress until we were kind of shut down a bit by the virus. We had a very large rally planned for last March, right about the time when everything shut down. And there are legislators who say, you know what, you would have gotten your bills through this time if it weren't for that happening. So we still have bills that we're working towards. We still are trying to put pressure. And really the way it changes is when the public becomes so informed and so aware and so outraged that they say, no, you don't get away with this any longer. And are we there yet? We don't know, but there will be a tipping point, and we're trying to move our way toward it. And once we get a little change, I believe the next changes will come quickly. It's the first breakthrough on that tight knot of dysfunction. Once we get the first breakthrough on that, we'll be able to change a lot of things. But really the way that happens is for people to lean in and to say, we want to understand this, we want to advocate on this. And as Amy said, we have hundreds and hundreds of people who had never talked to local government and we've had, I believe, 389 resolutions passed in local governments, townships and counties in support of an independent commission. We've had people figure out how to do it. We've had hundreds of people figure out how to go meet with their legislators, their senators and representatives and say, this really matters to me. I want it to change. We've had people figure out how to write letters to the editor and write hundreds of letters to the editor. So what we're basically encouraging people to say, okay, voting is really a good thing. The next step is to become a more active participant in government, to say our voices must be heard and to figure out how to make that happen. And when there are enough of us insisting on that, we will be heard and it will happen. That's the goal.
You do see that progress happening. You do see the move towards.
I do see that. Yeah. And I have to say, so there are legislators, it's kind of fun. There are legislators who have said, when we didn't get our bills passed in the last session, I was in Harrisburg when the final death toll for our bills in the last session, it didn't happen. And there were two women representatives who stopped me in the hall. I don't know if you are aware, but because of this tight knot of dysfunction, women legislators get almost no bills passed. almost zero, because the whole thing is controlled by the kind of the club, and the club, the people with seniority, the incumbents, they're the ones who run the committees. They're the ones who decide what bills move. They decide a great deal. So women legislators have almost no say, and they have very few bills that get passed. I think the last average I saw was one bill a session, if they're lucky, and not all of them get that one bill. So these two women stopped me and said, are you guys quitting? Because if you do, we're done. And I said, no, we're not quitting. They're like, yes, but there are legislators who've been there a long time who say the only way this changes is with public opinion, is with citizens insisting on something different. The leadership won't give up the power without the insistence of the public. And I think we're close. The virus has made it more difficult for us. And this crazy election has eaten up a lot of attention, but we encourage people to do what you're doing in this election, vote, but then afterwards, pour your energy into systemic change, and we will get this done. And let me just say one other thing on this, though. I've had legislators who don't support us at all say, Carol, you realize because of all the public attention on this, the maps will not be in 2021 what they were in 2011, because there's far too many people paying attention. Now we know what a good map looks like. Now we know what a really bad map looks like. Now we have really good ways there's a wonderful app called Days Redistricting app. We can just go online and test maps and see how they map out, what the analysis is. So we will be watching. So even if we don't get our bills passed, we will have much better maps in the next decade than we have now.
Dr. Kuniholm, thank you so much. This has been really, really interesting and exciting, and we really appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, absolutely. Common Hour audience, thanks for joining us as well. And it's time for us to say goodbye and move on to our next wonderful Zoom things. But yes, we appreciate you very much, Dr. Kuniholm.
Thank you.
Thank you.